how you're viewing these different Zoom calls. It might be difficult for you to see faces along with slides and so forth, but I personally have, thankfully, 2 screens that I use for work, and I can see all of your faces on one and my PowerPoint on the other, and I have my camera in the center, so I will be trying to focus on the camera for the most part, but there's times I'm going to be looking over at your faces on the side so that I can see you as well. Please, as we go through this presentation, do make sure to unmute yourself at any point in time that you would like to ask questions, make comments. Please interrupt me if you would like. I am perfectly fine with that. Please feel free to add any stories, examples, anything you want to add in as we dive in. But right now, I also want to make sure that you have paper or something to write on or to type onto, and a writing instrument with you as well, so that you can definitely take the time to jot down some reflections, some things that stand out to you as we go through this time, because this is going to be a reflective presentation. One other note, logistically, the details I have in the PowerPoint directly from the ACA Code of Ethics are direct quotes. I just wanted to note that as well. Okay, as we get rolling, a little bit about me. So I have a master's in counselor education and a doctorate in counseling psychology, but my primary duties have been training counselors for quite a number of years. I'm currently an associate professor at Bethel University, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. I have teaching experience in online programs, in person, community college, undergraduate, graduate, but my primary duties really have been focused on training counselors for the past 11 plus years. I also do some writing for Cengage Publishing at times, and I'm licensed in Minnesota and Wisconsin and an approved clinical supervisor, just so you have that awareness of my credentials and disclosures. Okay, is everyone ready to dive into talking about politics? I only see Hannah's face at the moment, and Hannah's nodding. We're not going to talk politics. We're going to talk around politics as we get into things today. So if you read the description, certainly that might be what drew you in, the idea of taking care of ourselves amidst the struggles that we might have at times working with clients whose views might be very different than ours. Traditionally, I've heard new counselors coming into training really talk a lot about the idea of, okay, I never want to work with such and such group or this or that. Convicted pedophiles is certainly the top of the list, but definitely recently I've been hearing a lot more rumblings about, ooh, I don't know if I want to work with someone who has that political perspective or that perspective on vaccine or their thoughts on COVID in this way. There's so many different perspectives that people have, and it can be quite a struggle to figure out how to manage them if they're so different than ours. So if you read the full session description, I just want to touch on this for a moment so we're on the same page. Certainly we have a lot of public health, social justice, and political circumstances going on right now. So I teach in St. Paul, Minnesota. Most of you are probably very aware of a trial going on in Minneapolis right now. If you're not, look it up because that's part of our current world. Certainly it's part of my immediate world in the location I live, but it can be very challenging when we're dealing with individuals who hold different views than we do. So really trying to figure out how to operate ethically with these clients is important so that we are allowing them to really have the space to be in their values versus our values getting in the way. So ultimately, I want us to think about how do we provide a safe environment for clients when our reactions sometimes might surprise even us. Okay, so we're going to focus a little bit on bracketing later on in the session, but I really just want you to take the time to be reflective today. Make sure you're thinking about your own reactions. Even as I talk about things, monitor your own reactions. If there's things that you disagree with, great, acknowledge that. Even bring it up and let's discuss it. But please just make sure you're paying attention to your own reactions as we discuss. When we think about politics, I really like this quote or this idea from Redding, who published an article, actually a chapter in 2020, where he would say it's cultural malpractice if we don't consider our clients' political values. We need to do that. But in order to do that effectively, we also have to know what our own are. We have to pay attention to that and have a sense of that. So we need to realize that the political beliefs and values of clients may be central to their particular worldview. They might be very important to their identity, and they might be very connected to their spiritual and religious beliefs. We have to keep that in mind when we're working with clients. Now, for some clients, politics are not going to be salient at all. Some clients aren't going to have any concerns related to anything going on in politics right now. But certainly in the situation we find ourselves in today's world, certainly there's pieces of that all clients might be struggling with to some extent. And we need to make sure we're paying attention to it from their values by also knowing what our values are in the first place. So ponder for just a moment, and again, take out your pen or pencil, whatever you have close by, and your paper, and jot down a few thoughts. Are you repelled by those who have political values different than yours? Take a moment and think about that. Think about the political values that are different than your values. And what are your reactions to those individuals or those groups? As you think about that, perhaps you're paying attention to your own biases. Are you aware of any specific biases you know you have against those who have political beliefs different than yours? Or view COVID different than you do? Or view the idea of a COVID vaccine, getting one, not getting one, different than you? What are your reactions? What are your biases? I'm going to give you about a minute more just to jot some notes down about that, whatever comes to mind. Some of you might be done writing, others might still be writing. I encourage you, even after our session, if you have things that are coming up that you are thinking about, write about it, journal it, put it down on paper so that that awareness really comes out for you, so you're paying attention to that. So let's consider ethics for a few minutes. This is important when we're thinking about how to work with clients, obviously. So we always have to remember our primary responsibility, respecting the dignity and promoting the welfare of clients. So when we're talking a specific client who's in front of us who might have views, values, perspectives, actions that are different than ours, we are trying to respect the dignity and welfare of those individuals. Yet at the same time, we also have to balance the idea of social justice in our field. So we have to consider carefully how we're going to manage that. When we think about informed consent, we have to make sure that we realize that clients have that freedom to really decide if they want to remain in a counseling relationship with us. They need to know enough about us to understand if they want to continue with that. Certainly some clients aren't really thinking through that process. They're just meeting with whoever they can get set up with, especially with the way waiting lists are often going at current times. But really we need to make sure that they have adequate information. One of the things we need to realize though is that some clients are going to research us in advance as well. We have to realize that what is out there on us in our personal lives might be something that a client can come across as well. So when you think about your own choices, your own preferences politically, related to public health, all of those pieces, we need to consider what's out there and how that is going to be seen by particular clients. Some clients, if you have a lot out on social media and clients are able to come across that, some clients might choose you as a result and some might choose not to come with you to see you as a result. And some might come in really guarded as a result of what they have read or seen on social media, especially if their views are different than yours. So we have to take that into consideration when we're thinking about working with clients. We also have to obviously consider avoid harm. We know this. We're trying to avoid harming the clients. So we have to consider carefully what it is that we do put out on social media. If you're someone who really is wanting to be politically active, that is wonderful. Yet at the same time, you have chosen or are choosing a profession that really information that's out there on you could certainly significantly impact the welfare of different clients. So we have to consider that as well. And really importantly, this is key to our conversation today, our personal values. We have to be aware of our personal values. If we don't have that awareness in the first place, if we're not paying attention to our own values, then it's much more likely that we're going to impose them on clients. This is definitely something the majority of you have heard talked about before. We need to know that information about ourselves so that we can avoid imposing our values on others. When it comes to politics, when it comes to the vaccine, when it comes to COVID, when it comes to all of our current circumstances at present, there's some of us that might not have spent enough time reflecting on these types of values. And it's important that we do that we take that time to consider what our values are so that we can avoid imposing them on our clients. And as I mentioned before, we do have to consider advocacy. This is part of the field of counseling. This is a priority for sure. We need to consider when it's appropriate to do so and figure out how to do this appropriately in relation to individual clients, but then obviously society as a whole as well. Yet we have to balance these different roles we might have and determine what is most appropriate given whatever work you as an individual do and your setting. I do just briefly want to bring up this idea of termination and referral because this does come into play. If you had a client who came in and you really feel that you have that lack of competence to be of assistance to the client because of how extreme their values are in comparison to yours, don't just make that decision on your own. It is very, very important that if you're really going to determine that you don't have the competence, that you're discussing that with supervisors, colleagues, documenting that to make sure that then a client's not coming back and saying that this is somehow connected to you not taking the care of the steps that you should related to them. So it's really important that you are carefully consulting anytime you're thinking about terminating with a client and referring because of competence. And we need to make sure that we are not just referring based on our own held values, attitudes, beliefs, behaviors, so forth. So we have to really carefully look at this. Certainly there can be times where the competence and our values might go hand in hand, but again, that documentation legally to protect yourself, to make sure that it's clear that you are referring based on competence rather than because of your values. That's very important to make sure you're covering. And we need to make sure we are really considering, is the relationship working? Are we benefiting the client? And that's part of what can come into play in relation to competence. So A11C is certainly an important one to refer to. So as a professor, I'm coming back to these ethics codes all the time, talking to my students about a variety of different things in the ACA and other codes of ethics, depending on you and your position as a student. Perhaps you're already in the field, perhaps some of you are educators yourselves. The amount of time we come back to these might be different, but I want to remind everyone how important it is to make sure that we are regularly looking at the code of ethics and really considering all these pieces. It's really easy to just think that, well, I remember I had it in class, I remember what it is. It's so important to come back to these on a regular basis to remind ourselves what it is that's expected of us professionally so that we are operating as ethically as possible. When we think about professional responsibility, it's really important that we are making sure we are not discriminating. We're going to talk a little bit about what legally counts as discrimination in a few moments. But I want to really think about that we are making sure that we are not discriminating against others, even if their political values are such that they're way off what we believe. We have to make sure that we are considering that carefully and not discriminating against people. And really importantly, we need to make sure that we engage in self-care activities so that we are really taking care of ourselves. Perhaps that's why some of you chose this session, because of that idea of taking care of our own mental health. Really taking the time to reflect and pay attention to our own values, our own reactions, our own biases, really is advanced work to be able to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves down the road as well. If we haven't taken that time to reflect on our values, again, it's more likely that we're going to impose our values on clients and more likely that we're going to have many different problems that can come up in sessions with clients and possibly ethically and legally. So we need to make sure that we are doing good self-care. So even as we go through this session, again, some of you might honestly check out at different times because you have something on your mind that you are suddenly deciding you want to write down about. It's great. Take care of yourself. Pay attention to what's going on with you and your reactions with any of what we're talking about today. And do make sure that amidst this wonderful Zoom conference that we all get to attend, that you are considering, okay, how this is helpful for self-care to be able to interact and meet together, even though virtually, with colleagues and other students, and really have the chance to choose the sessions that interest us the most, but also making sure that you are finding other ways to take care of yourself on a regular basis. Competence, I've already talked a little bit about this, but we need to make sure we are working within the boundaries of our competence. But keep in mind, multicultural counseling competence is required across any of the specialties any of us might have. So we need to make sure that this awareness we're talking about today, this reflection, that this is part of what's expected of each of us, regardless of our specialty area. So yes, there's particular areas that we can develop further competence in related to multicultural counseling competency, but we're all expected to be on that journey of multicultural competence throughout our careers. And I just wanted to note from the ACA Code of Ethics that advertising and the idea of soliciting clients, getting clients in the first place, we need to really make sure that we're not condoning or engaging in any discriminatory practices in relation to that in the first place. So when you look at this description here, you can see age, culture, disability, ethnicity, race, religion, spirituality, and all the rest that are listed here. It doesn't say anything about politics, political views, view on COVID, any of, like, that's not in here specifically, right? Just want to note that. One of the things that I also want to point out, this is, again, one of the states I'm licensed in is Wisconsin. So this is from some of the details from Wisconsin law. So unprofessional conduct, we can't discriminate on the basis of all these other factors that we've just listed off. Most of your states are going to have something that looks something similar to this, might be even more specific, but make sure you know your specific state laws related to the field you're practicing in. So political discrimination laws specifically, make sure y'all know I'm not a lawyer. I have no legal training. I can't claim that I understand any of the details when it comes to a lot related to law. But what I have looked at, what I have researched is that we technically, based on federal law, don't have protection from political discrimination. Okay, so when we look back, just as I flip slides here, discrimination on the basis of age, so and forth. Again, here in the ACA Code of Ethics in a very similar way. We don't want to discriminate against these pieces. Technically, again, political discrimination is not listed there, and federal law, as far as I understand, does not give protection related to political discrimination. Some state laws do have particular protection. So again, knowing your particular state and state laws, you need to know that. Yet we also have to be very careful in relation to this. Best practice, obviously, just don't discriminate on any of these factors, but we have to realize that political preferences are often very tied to someone's spiritual, religious views. It could be related to their gender identity and pushing for a particular set of laws related to that, sexual orientation. Possibly marital status, that might be a issue for someone that they find very important in their lives. Abortion is another hot button issue that some people might really bring up into counseling in some way that might be very different from your own views. We have to realize that these political preferences that might come out are often very tied to other pieces that, or other traits that do have protection legally. So we have to make sure we're paying attention to that. So ultimately, I'd encourage you not to discriminate politically, because it's most likely going to be tied in some way to one of these other statuses that individuals might have. Okay, any comments or questions so far? I'll give just a moment more to see if anyone's going to come up with anything. Again, feel free, anyone who's joined us recently, you can certainly unmute yourself at any point in time. Okay, so we're going to spend a little time examining ourselves now. So really some reflection time here where we're thinking about our own values, our own perspectives on all of this. One thing I like to point out is that some of us might not have a particular identity established related to perhaps politics. Some individuals who might be in the session right now might very strongly identify politically in one realm or the other, and some do not. So I just want to bring up these ideas of identity statuses to give us a perspective here as well. This applies obviously to ourselves, but also to clients. So if someone has actually made a commitment and has said that, hey, this is how I view things politically, this is how I am going to do it, perhaps they've created that as a piece of their identity. They have identity achievement there. But some people might still be in identity moratorium where they are exploring in an attempt to establish an identity, but have not yet made a commitment. So even we can narrow this down even to things like the idea of vaccines. Some of you might have already had vaccines. Some of you are choosing not to. Some of you are still possibly in this identity moratorium in relation to that, trying to figure out, do I want to, do I not? Because you're actively exploring information to try to make sense of that. Identity foreclosure, though, is where some individuals have made a commitment, but really have not explored the options. So some people have chosen to follow a particular political party, for example, because that's how they were brought up. That's what their family did. That's what they feel like they're expected to do without really taking it on as an identity themselves. I think this is really key to think about in relation to clients. If someone comes in and is saying, hey, I identify as this or I identify as that, and yet you don't take the time to further explore that a little bit to really see if this is an identity they've chosen, if this is really something that they've explored and taken on, or if it's just because they have taken on the values that they have perhaps grown up with, we have to consider that carefully. Okay, that relates to so many different identities that we might identify with, including religion, spirituality, and so forth. Identity diffusion is where we just haven't even explored it at all. We haven't made a commitment to any identity. We choose not to explore it or just don't want to. And even in relation to politics and COVID and all of that, that is where some of you are sitting today, and that's okay. Okay, it's important just to realize where we're at related to that. So I want you just to take a moment, I'll give you about a minute or so, just to jot down some thoughts about where you're at in relation to your political preferences and identity. Perhaps the idea of vaccine or whatever else is coming up for you with what we've talked about so far.
Hi, this is Michelle. I actually was having this conversation. I was doing supervision yesterday, and I had this conversation with my group and about just, we as quote unquote essential workers have our vaccines, but a lot of the public, and I used to work in community mental health, and they still work in community mental health. So the organization even has vaccines available to the consumers who are going there for services, and they can't even fill the appointments with the people because they don't want to get it. They don't know how, they won't come back. And so even just kind of helping them understand and navigating those conversations around why, like the fear, the knowledge, the education, the psycho, like all of those different layers of what that means, and not so much guiding the decision. But then they also talked about, like, well, what if I don't want to see somebody that they don't get the vaccine? What does that look like? And they're all telehealth now. But still, it's a conversation that they probably will be having to have moving forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are very challenging topics in so many different circumstances. And depending on the work you're doing and the state you're in and so forth, there's lots of challenges in relation to how, as professionals, we're going to handle different things related to this. So even as you talked about that, Michelle, the idea of identity diffusion, there's certainly some individuals who are choosing not to get a vaccine just because they don't even want to explore the option, don't want to make any sort of commitment to that, whereas others are choosing not to get the vaccine because of specific identity achievement that they have, that they're holding to something and have made some sort of commitment. Perhaps there's a whole host of different reasons someone might choose that. So there's such a wide perspective of different things that might happen. And obviously, and this is, I feel like I'm preaching to the choir in some ways here, but we need to realize that exploring what's behind why someone is choosing a decision or why they have particular political beliefs or not, sometimes that is certainly going to rub us the wrong way when their beliefs, their values are very different than ours. But we need to understand behind it, what is behind those beliefs, those values, so we can understand and help the client from their set of values rather than trying to impose ours onto them. Does anyone else have any thoughts or comments that they want to share before we move on? Again, feel free to unmute yourself. If you're not comfortable doing that, you can certainly add to the chat if people.
Can you hear me?
Yep, I can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, I want to know, do you think this falls really under some kind of, I posted this in the chat, it's almost like a cultural competency or some kind of, it's not, but it's some sensibility around, you know, I had a great mentor years ago who said, you know, be open, not empty. So you can hold your values, and be open, but while also, you know, that's holding two contrasting thoughts is a sign of intelligence, right? You know, so it's almost like a distinct competency that's not quite cultural, but is something, you know. What have you grasped?
Well, I would say, Heather, that it goes under cultural competency, in my opinion. Now, certainly people can have different opinions on this, but because of how tied it is to many of those identities people often have that do tie directly to multicultural competence, I would say that this definitely falls under cultural competency to some extent, not in the traditional way we think about it, yet this is something that we need to really consider and figure out how we can appropriately work with the clients who have these different values than us, because their political decisions, their political life, their choices, their thoughts on COVID and the vaccine, all of that comes from their worldview, their values, and that ultimately does very much relate to cultural competency for how we're going to work with them in relation to that. I also see a post from Candace that I'm just going to pull from the chat. She said, if we can't get over our political bias enough that it is obvious it is getting in the way of our work, even after supervision is referring out, considered discrimination. It's going to certainly depend on your particular state laws, but if we ultimately, if it's going to be something that's about us and our self-care, our ability to work effectively as a counselor, we need to figure out what we're going to do for our own self-care. This is where it's not a yes or no answer here, Candace, and for others. It's not an absolutely yes, it's discrimination, or absolutely no, it's discrimination. It's going to depend on the very specific situation, your state laws, your supervisor, colleagues you consult with, and in some cases, if you need to actually consult a lawyer to determine what's appropriate, that's something that might need to happen. And it's going to be the specific situation that will determine if it's discrimination or not. And again, it's going to depend on the details of your state. And if your state has some sort of protection against political discrimination, well, then that's going to make that a little bit clearer. And that's where working with supervisors, colleagues, to make sure that you are doing what you need to do appropriate self-care, get the training you might need, so forth, to be able to properly work with an individual whose values are so distinctly different than yours, is something that is important. Any other thoughts? Thank you, Heather. You're onto something. Hope you'll write on this. I do plan to write on this to some extent. Others have in beyond the counseling field have written on this concept. It's less covered in the counseling field, but really seems important given the political environment we're currently in, to just really consider this in relation to cultural competence as well. Any other thoughts? Okay. So I want you to think for a second about yourself and your own politics. As I said, this is going to be a reflective session. We have 25-ish minutes left, little less. So just monitoring the time, I want you to be aware of that we're going to spend some time now on reflection, and if we have time, possible small group discussion. So I want you to take a few minutes to create a developmental timeline for yourself related to politics specifically. So when did you first become aware of politics? Think back, try to think about what age you were at. What were the circumstances? What were the influences in your life? What are the key circumstances that stand out to you? Maybe there's particular elections that stand out to you. There's different times that you've had shifts in how you see different things politically. And try to bring it all the way up to present time and how your perspective on our most recent election, how that influenced you, how you saw things, how COVID, vaccine, all of that influences how you see these things. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes to create your own developmental timeline. So take this time to really think about this, and obviously expand on it when we are outside of this session as well, to really have that awareness for yourself of how this is for you as a person, what your influences are, and so forth. Okay, so I'm going to set a timer for 5 minutes. So so you don't just hear me sitting here breathing, I'm going to unmute, or I'm going to mute myself for those 5 minutes. Then I'll let you know when time's up. So get to your timelines, and timer is starting now.
5 states here get some extra vaccine, because 5 states are now accounting for more than 40% of all COVID cases. New York, Michigan.
Okay, just a couple more minutes to work on your timeline. Putting anything you want on there.
I'm going to put the poll questions in the chat. If you're done a few minutes early, if you could just look at those 3 questions, and they're just yes or no questions. So if you could look at those and respond, that would be great.
Okay, thank you for taking the time to create a developmental timeline. Again, it's this awareness. We need this awareness of what's going on with ourselves internally so that we're able to bracket that information. One of the things I do want you to consider, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but if you haven't ever taken the time to think about what your own personal values are, and where they come from, I encourage you to do that as well. This is just one list of many. I also find the card sort that is available through motivationalinterviewing.org to be very helpful. It's free there. It's something you can use with clients as well, but I think it's so important to understand what drives us. So some of these particular words might grab you and some might repel you, but then you might have clients that might really grab certain ones that are very different than yours. Again, we have to have that awareness of our values in order to bracket them to be able to work with our clients' values instead. So think for a moment how your values relate to your political stance, what you're aware of your own values presently. How does that relate to your own political stance? Take a moment, jot down a few thoughts. I also want you just to think about your values in relation to the ACA list of core professional values. So these here, if you haven't spent much time reflecting on them, think about them outside of our time here today. Think about them a little more in depth related to what you see as your core values for you as a human being, what drives you as a person. Reflect on them in comparison to the ACA professional values. There might be some of these that you put above others, and there might be some from your personal life that relate very strongly to some of these. It's just important to understand how what your own values are fit with our values as professionals as well. And if they don't, or how they don't, and how you reconcile that for yourself in the work you do as a counselor. So let's take the rest of our time to talk a little bit about bracketing. So before I give you a specific definition for bracketing, I want you to remember that with all of this, this does not ever mean that we let go of who we are. We are not expected as counselors to let go of our own beliefs, our own values, our own views. We are allowed to have those. We are allowed to hold on to those. But we have to consider what we do with that when we're working with clients, right? Because we can't push our values onto clients. We have to consider how to handle that. I really like this quote. It's from quite a while ago, but back in 1980, Bergen wrote this: "If we are unable to face our own values openly, it means we are unable to face ourselves, which violates a primary principle of professional conduct in our field." I do think this continues to ring true. It's very important to know that we have to face our own values. We have to be aware of that to do our best work as counselors. So bracketing, I really like this particular definition from 2014. It's the intentional setting aside of the counselor's personal values in order to provide ethical and appropriate counseling to all clients, especially those whose worldviews, values, belief systems, and decisions differ significantly from those of the counselor. So it's an intentional practice. For it to be intentional, again, we have to have that awareness in the first place. We have to have that opportunity to reflect on our values, how our own politics influence how we might see things with clients. We have to consider that carefully. I don't know about you, but personally, when I use brackets on my keyboard, I'm looking down at my keyboard right now. For whatever reason, with how I was trained in typing, I have to be very intentional about how I hit the keys. Otherwise, I'm going to use the wrong one. It's just something because of how I was taught, it's just not something that naturally comes. We have to realize that it's not something that's often going to naturally come. We have to be intentional about it. Even having particular signals to ourselves, thinking about how we want to remind ourselves to bracket before we're sitting down with clients is very important, because it's a challenge. It's a challenge to take that which we hold tightly to, our own values, our own beliefs, and set them aside. This is much easier when we're dealing with clients who have the same views, the same values as us, but we also have to remember that each person is unique, and it can be sometimes just as challenging when we're meeting with someone who has what we think are the same values as us, and they're seeing things differently, because we have to realize their perspective on things versus our own. We have to make sure we're thinking through that. So in all of this, awareness is so key. It's so necessary. So we have to have that awareness of our views and our values, where we're at with our identity, before we're able to do the bracketing in the first place. Okay. So some of you might work with clients who overall have very similar values to you, and this is something you don't feel like you have to intentionally do very often. But some might encounter situations on a regular basis where this bracketing has to happen intentionally to make sure we can really take the perspective of the client and work with them from their values rather than our own. So without censoring yourself, I do want you to just think about this for a moment. Because we're talking politics, I want you to think about, and you won't have to share these reactions, these are just for yourself. But when I say something like Donald Trump, what comes to your mind? For some of you, when I say Joe Biden, you might have different reactions. Both of those two people, what are your, without censoring yourself, what are your true reactions? And as a result of those reactions, what assumptions might you make about a client who comes to you who says they voted for Donald Trump? What assumptions might you make about a client who comes to you and says they voted for Joe Biden? I just want you to think about that. Think about your reactions to individuals who might have voted the same as you, or different than you, or choose not to vote. Any of that. Just think about that for a moment and jot down whatever else comes to your mind. One of the things I want us to be aware of is this idea of politically based countertransference. Countertransference can happen with many different things, including politics. So we have to be able to identify our triggers, to be able to know what those situations are that are going to be challenging, so that we can take that intentional time to bracket. There are going to be times where you suddenly, in the midst of a session, realize, wow, I'm having a reaction. I need to make sure I'm bracketing things. But there's also going to be ways we can do this in advance, paying attention and having an awareness of your triggers. So notice things like that. Pay attention to how you react to news stories, how you react to different things that family members, friends, whoever might say, and really pay attention to that. Dig deep into that, paying attention to your own reactions, your own triggers, so that you can be best prepared to truly be with the client, listening to the client who's in front of you without pushing your values onto them. So you can think about situations in your life right now. So for some of you, there might be very clear rules in your family or in your culture or in whatever situations you're regularly in where you don't discuss things like politics and religion. That's common to a lot of families. We don't have that option when it comes to clients. If they are bringing up politics, religion as salient to them, as something that is really important in their identity, again, then that is part of our multicultural competence to make sure that we are able to properly address that from their set of values. If it's related to the work that they are wanting to do, their goals, we need to make sure that we are paying attention to that, not just ignoring that. So if you're someone who has grown up with those unwritten rules of don't talk about politics, don't talk about religion, don't talk about this, that, be aware of that, pay attention to that, and figure out how to work through that so that you are not doing that with clients. Because if this is something that's important to them and their mental health, the direction that they need to go, we need to make sure that we are bringing that in an appropriate way to the work we're doing. And we're not, I wish we had time, but we are at 5 minutes left. So I want you to take just a couple minutes in reflection time and jot down a few thoughts to these questions. What's a key takeaway for you? What changes might you need to implement? And what might you do differently as a result of what we've discussed today? So take a few moments and write that down. I'll give you about 2 minutes and then we'll have a few minutes left for questions and comments. Okay, any questions or comments? Again, feel free to unmute yourself and show us your face if you are willing to do so. You can unmute yourself without your video, that's fine as well.
Hi, this is Heather again. I think, I think as a counselor educator, I've had to work around this too in the classroom, right? In situations and those kinds of boundaries. And I think it's been a teachable moment for myself When, for example, maybe a student is adverse to a certain scenario, and so that gives me more information about their worldview, right? And then I can you know, the opportunistic thing to do is to really and what I've done in some situations is to confirm, you know, if you had a client, refusal to treat is a non-option, right? So you can't pick and choose things that, you know, if it's a certain kind of topic that they're adverse from. So making sure that I'm doing due diligence there. And then secondly, you know, finding out what kind of topic piques their interest. So I'm gathering more information of their mental map of, like, say, on an advocacy topic, you know, that aligns to who they are. So I think it's an and both, you know. And that being said, once I do that and they move along to another professor, then, you know, in again, a student scenario where there's kind of a certain worldview, then I've given them kind of that opportunity, and then someone else might react differently to that, or maybe less tolerant or more rigid. And so, you know, I always give them a disclaimer that not everyone is so broad to move like this. And I'm doing that to model this to you, that, you know, I can validate your worldview and see your perspective, and then also find something that you feel very passionate or about. So anyway, a long story short, I think that that's a teachable moment in a class too.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Heather. Any other questions or comments? We've got just 2 minutes left before you have to hop to your next session. Okay, thank you all for joining me today. I appreciate the attentiveness and the willingness to reflect. Again, take more time on this. An hour just touching on this, especially given the world in which we're currently living in and all of the circumstances that can touch our lives in so many different ways that have a political vein to them. I really encourage you to continue to reflect on this, to really think about how your own views and your own values need to be bracketed so that you can best work with those who are coming to see you, so that you can care for them in the way they need. Enjoy the rest of your time with this wonderful conference.